U.S. President Donald Trump says Washington is in talks with Beijing on tariffs, and a deal could be done soon.
I would think over the next 3 or 4 weeks, I think maybe the whole thing could be concluded.
Mr. Trump would not say whether he has spoken directly with Chinese President Xi, but insists that China has been in touch since tariffs were imposed. Reports say the two sides are in contact, but not at the level needed to strike a deal. China's Commerce Ministry says interactions with the U.S. have remained at a normal working level. For more analysis, we're now joined by Kurt Tong, managing partner at the Washington-based business consultancy, the Asia Group. And Ambassador Tong has held many senior U.S. State Department positions and is a specialist in diplomacy and economic affairs in East Asia. Ambassador Tong, thank you so much for speaking with us this evening. Now, both sides are reportedly in trade talks, with Mr. Trump signaling a potential end to the tit-for-tat tariff hikes between Washington and Beijing. How optimistic are you that there's still space for a genuine diplomatic reset?
I think it's going to take time. There's really not that much evidence available that there is this, as you reported, a sufficient level of communication at a sufficiently high level to start to kick off a real substantive discussion between the U.S. and China. China's doing quite a bit of standard issue posturing at this point, canceling trips to the United States, cutting off the lower level communication channels, while still saying, as you reported, that communications are taking place on a normal basis. Essentially, the Beijing side is saying that the U.S. needs to come to it on China's terms and give some indication of flexibility and fairly bold willingness to bring the U.S. and China out of this current conundrum of extraordinarily high tariffs.
You're saying that this will take time, Ambassador, but how far do you see both sides willing to compromise, and how far do you see them willing to defend their corner?
Well, I think they're very willing to defend their corner, and both sides are saying that a lot explicitly for both the domestic political audience and in terms of positioning with the other. As for flexibility, I think that China will ultimately be willing to address a lot of the U.S. concerns about market access, about the structure of the trade relationship, and perhaps even other issues beyond that. I do think that they are rather firmly opposed to the concept of negotiating while there is not even yet a formal ceasefire, if you will, in terms of U.S. escalatory actions. So that's the source of my lack of optimism in the near term on this, is that President Xi is in a position that of strength domestically in terms of Chinese politics. He's showing his ability to reach other countries with this tour to Southeast Asia and creating a playing field where he thinks the United States needs to come to him rather than the other way around.
And we also know that the European Union and China are planning a summit in Beijing in July. Japan and South Korea have also agreed to work with China to advance trade and investment. Do you sense that this is the start of China's positioning itself as a responsible global player, defending world order and fighting protectionism?
Well, I think it's more than the start of that. I think that is actually happening. I do think it's a tough idea for China to sell that it is the responsible trading partner because of the overcapacity problems and the closed nature of the Chinese market. But it's going to work really hard on this and is making some progress, as you indicated. I think the most pivotal point is the China-EU discussion. That seems to be moving along smartly and could switch into something that's rather substantive. The Japan, Korea, China channel that you mentioned, I'm a little more pessimistic about that really panning out into anything substantively economically. The question really is, how long does the U.S.-China standoff go on? How long does the United States continue to put pressure on non-China interlocutors versus trying to fold them into the U.S. camp on this struggle. And then that timing question becomes very important because ultimately China will start to make moves like a renewed request to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which could really put the U.S. on the back foot.
There are also concerns that Mr. Trump's behavior would also lead Beijing to swamp global markets with goods to prop up its own domestic economy. Your thoughts on this?
So that would be counterproductive to the strategy of trying to be the responsible partner and reach out to the global south, Europe and Asia. So I actually anticipate, and what my findings were from attending the China Development Forum, is that China's ready to take more measures domestically to create domestic demand to absorb more of its productive capacity. That's difficult. They're not very good at it. And there's been a lot of promises made and not kept in terms of increasing Chinese domestic consumption. But there is room to move there. And I think that China's discovering that it actually is not a disaster if it draws down its own savings more and owes more money to itself, essentially, in order to boost consumption.
Meanwhile, Ambassador, trade talks between the U.S. and other nations such as Japan and Indonesia are gaining momentum, though we have yet to see any immediate breakthrough. From a strategic perspective, how sustainable do you think is Mr. Trump's tariff rollouts and reversals? And what does this mean for economies that are looking for an agreement with him?
Well, I think that these counterparts, Japan was in town this week and had some rather substantive discussions, including directly with President Trump. These counterpart economies are quite worried, intimidated by the chaotic nature of the rollout of the so-called reciprocal tariffs. And they're concerned about negotiating channels, concerned about timelines. They are ready to work with the United States and reach resolution on some measures with the intent of bringing these tariffs down to reasonable levels. I think there's also, because of the moves that China's making, an incentive for the United States to try and bring those tariffs down and keep them down at a more reasonable level on an accelerated timeline. Otherwise, they lose ground globally. And I sense that understanding starting to creep into the president's statements and actions. But he's also contending with some fairly kind of self-created myths about the ability of tariffs to magically convince other countries to do things that need to be stepped down from on the U.S. side.
We also understand that defense cost sharing is set to be included in these tariff talks with America's Asian allies, such as Japan and South Korea in particular. Despite their efforts to separate security talks from trade, Mr. Trump describing it as a one-stop shopping negotiations. What do you make of his approach of linking trade talks with security issues?
Well, I think that defense expenditure and procurement changes, those are big issues that move slowly in new directions. I believe that both Korea, South Korea, and Japan are ready to take additional measures to contribute more to the shared defense. These are strong treaty alliances that the United States has with the Republic of Korea and with Japan. The U.S.-Australia alliance is also being upgraded very rapidly. So I do think that the U.S. is pushing on an open door. The question is whether these countries are going to be willing to give up sovereignty over their decision-making on defense expenditure decided by their own democratic processes. And I don't think they will do that. I do think they will make some statements and some soft promises leading in the direction that the United States would like to go, and that ultimately the U.S. will find satisfaction with that.
But Ambassador, Mr. Trump has made it clear that he sees alliance relationships as transactional. Do you see his reopening of defense talks at these meetings as a deliberate pressure tactic?
Absolutely. It's all transactions for him. And these countries, to their credit, are adjusting to this new framework for understanding relations with the United States rather quickly and in a mature fashion. Based upon their long-term national interest. They don't like it, and it makes for a very negative atmosphere, despite the smiles and in the Oval Office, et cetera. It's putting real pressure on these the long-term fundamental hearts and minds aspects of the alliance relationships. But on a transactional basis, I think most of these allies of the United States are willing to step forward and do what's necessary to keep the alliances strong.
Depending on how far Mr. Trump's tariff strategy will go, Ambassador, and how long it will go on, in what ways will this accelerate economic decoupling between the U.S. and Asia? And what would be the broader consequences for regional growth here in the region?
So absolutely, if the U.S. Insists on isolating itself from the rest of the global trading economy, the most important part of which is in Asia, through high tariffs, particularly on China, but also on the other countries, as we discussed, that will lead to slower growth, lost income and job opportunities in the United States, higher inflation for everyone concerned. The real question that I'm grappling with right now is this going to be the U.S. trying to isolate China, or is it the U.S. isolating itself? That's a fundamentally different situation, and we'll find out the answer to that over the next 3, 4, 5 months, I believe. The U.S.-China piece is the decoupling is being pushed on by both sides, I think. Right now, the U.S. feels like the aggressor, but China's unwillingness to change its economic structure and be more market-oriented over a long-term basis is another fundamental cause of this. If we have more decoupling between the United States and China, which I think is a very real possibility, deeper decoupling, both sides will lose from that.
And in light of China's recent diplomatic outreach to tariff-hit nations like Vietnam, Cambodia, and Malaysia, as we've seen, how do you see Asian economies navigating the road ahead to mitigate the negative effects of these tariffs and maintain stable economic growth amid, this rising protectionism?
Yeah, for the Southeast Asian economies, particularly Vietnam, I think this is a even more difficult agenda than it is for, say, Japan and Korea, because they don't have the same technology and investment to offer as partners of the United States. So they're under real pressure to contribute to reducing the U.S. trade deficits, which were not really of their causing. They are just following market forces and exporting a lot to the United States. So they want to maintain that as much as possible, but are being pushed by the U.S. on that side. China, for its sake, will be making sure that the outcomes of these talks do not really impinge on China's interests. Southeast Asian countries are rightfully concerned that they're getting squeezed in between here, and it's reducing opportunities for them. I think there's a chance here for businesses to step in and on their own accord figure out ways to navigate through all of this, make money in Southeast Asia, multinational corporations, not just U.S., but Europe, Japan, and others, and find a way through this that will really set them up for the long term. Because over the long term, I do believe that the magnetic forces of economic attraction between large economies will start to overcome the politics.
Appreciate your thoughts and time, Ambassador. Thank you so much for speaking with us. Ambassador Kurt Tong, the managing partner at the Asia Group.